Welcome back to our special interview program. We're very honored that this week we're joined in studio here in Washington, D.C. on K Street by Congressman Ronald Dellums. Mayor Ronald Dellums, you've done many things in your life. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, my friend.
Thank you. Ronald Dellums, you've had the opportunity to see U.S. government policy in a big picture, perhaps in a global way, in your many years, perhaps decades in Congress. Mm-hmm. You've also been the mayor of one of the most important cities in the United States, Oakland, California. Yes. We're in a period of immense transition. Mm-hmm. It started perhaps in 2009 when President Obama took the presidency. Maybe the transition's not quite as fast as some people expected. But in the big picture, how do you see the United States emerging? Is there a big, sharp break in foreign policy under the Obama administration, or is continuity the more dominant trend?
I think there's an effort on the part of the Obama administration to break with tradition, and that makes sense to me because the world is changing. I'm going to offer you what may, in some quarters, be considered controversial. I think the definition of national security, as we have articulated it and made it operational in the past, no longer obtains. I'm suggesting to you that no nation, including the United States, can maintain their national security on their own. The problems of the world, tend to be more global in nature, which means you've got to reach out to the global community, and B, the problems of the world tend not to lend themselves to a military solution. The problems of the world tend to be political and economic, social and cultural, and they need to be solved in that context. So I think the Obama administration is making an effort to move in that direction, and I think that makes sense to me.
Well, let me ask you, if you can kind of step back and look at the big picture, yes. The historical picture. You were an outspoken critic of the war in Vietnam, yes, when you entered the Congress in 1971, during the first term of the Nixon administration. The war was still escalating, even though Nixon was promising an end to the war. After that, it looked like the United States would refrain from further interventions. Mm-hmm. But then we saw a pattern. There was the Panama invasion in 1989, the first Iraq war in 1990-91. There was the war in Afghanistan a decade later, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Is it a warfare state? Is it a state of endless intervention in spite of who the personality is at the top?
Well, I think you have to, you know that old saying, you have to play the hand that's dealt you. I mean, you've got to deal with the realities of the world as you see them. But again, I think you've hit upon something, that this continued need to intervene, to intervene militarily, in my humble opinion, is an awesome mistake. Counterinsurgency is not what American troops are trained to deal with. All right. These problems ultimately are not military problems. We've spent billions of dollars. Thousands of people have lost their lives, and at the end of the day, for what purpose? If it is to combat terrorism, then terrorism is not something that you win on a battlefield. You and I need to be able to communicate with each other. You from your respective nation, me from mine, and all of us from our many respective places. We used to say back in the 60s, when we were in the civil rights movement, that there's no such thing as a bigot in a foxhole. And people understand that. When you're confronted with a common threat, it doesn't matter what your differences are. You know, you say, look, I don't care what color you are, keep shooting, help me, all right? Well, fast forward to 2012. My point is that the definition of the foxhole has changed. The foxhole is the entire planet, and we're all in it.
Okay. You were, as you mentioned, in the 60s, it brought to my mind the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. He came out in 1967, 1 year before he was assassinated, at that famous speech at Riverside Church opposing the war in Vietnam. And he made the point very eloquently that the bombs being dropped in Southeast Asia were bursting in the inner cities of the United States, meaning you couldn't really have a war abroad and effectively fight poverty at home.
Right.
You were the mayor of Oakland, California, a city that's plagued with all the same problems that urban communities are plagued with around the country: high unemployment, problems with education. When you saw that the Bush administration was going to war in Iraq, did you feel that that would be, as Dr. King saw it also in the 60s, of detriment to the people, the urban areas, the areas in need inside the United States?
Not only did I believe it, we experienced it.
Okay.
All right? Because the priorities of this country were dramatically affected by the decision to spend hundreds of millions of dollars into the billions of dollars fighting a war, which meant that those resources weren't available to address the realities of the human misery that is confronted by millions of people living in the cities and the towns of America, okay? Stimulus effort notwithstanding, so that at least that those, in the stimulus effort, remember, that came after President Obama was elected and they passed the stimulus package. The first 2 years that I was mayor of Oakland, we were fighting in, foreign countries. And there was no help to the cities. And it was during that time that we started to see this incredible deterioration. So you're absolutely right. You can't spend all this money waging war and then turn around and try to address the human misery that's confronted by people in the urban environment. Like many mayors used to say, homeland security is one thing, hometown security is something else. You got to be able to have security on the ground. That didn't happen. But then let's add on top of the quote that you gave from Martin Luther King, another quote from Martin Luther King that is appropriate to this moment. Peace is more than simply the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. Now, I extrapolated that slightly different to make the same point. Peace is more than simply the absence of war. It is the absence of conditions that give rise to war. And that's human pain and human suffering, all right? Well, that's the point that we're making right now. Look at all the human misery and pain that is being felt by people in this country and the global economics that has visited pain upon people living in the cities and the towns all over the world.
Yeah.
Tremendous pain, tremendous misery.
We see a situation where today the President Obama said that there will be a slowing in growth of the military budget over the next decade, but it still will grow. And yet in the United States, there are perhaps 40 million people who are either unemployed or underemployed. Millions have lost their homes or are threatened with foreclosure because they can't pay their mortgages to the banks. Mm-hmm. Is it time for the United States to say, and I think this is something that you were arguing for decades ago, to convert the economy from a war economy to a peace economy? In other words, to trying to meet civilian needs. Is the military-industrial complex so strong that that's just a pipe dream?
No, I don't think it is a pipe dream. I think ultimately you can make that transition, but you got to do it thoughtfully, and I understand that. Okay, I mean, as you mature, you realize that the world's not, black and white. That you've got to make certain kinds of transitional moves. I think that we are moving in the direction. Downsizing the military is a budget issue. Right-sizing the military is a policy issue. We ought to be talking about policy, and that is, instead of saying, oh, look at these huge cuts in the military budget, we ought to be looking at what should the military be doing going forward from 2012? What are the real threats out there that we're really looking at? Not yesterday's threats, but the threats that we perceive now and the threats going forward. That, at the end of the day, in my humble opinion, will end up being a significantly reduced military because our threats are radically different than the threats in the past. So when President Obama says we need to get rid of Cold War weapons and these kind of things, he's on the right path. So we need to right-size the military based on where it needs to go. Now, in the transition from now to then, it may be that it stays relatively high for a while, but I think ultimately it goes down. The second thing is maybe it's just politics as well, because now we are in a presidential election, and the Republicans, what has been their challenge to the president? They're saying he's weak on defense. All right. So then the president says our military is not going to drop precipitously. We're not going to make the mistakes that we made at the end of the Vietnam War, at the end of the Second World War. We're going to do this intelligently. All right. So what I think he's trying to signal to the American people is this will not be a precipitous drop. This will be a thoughtful transition to a military that ultimately makes sense in the context of the threats that we perceive going forward. Does that make sense? I'm just saying politically.
In 1993, I believe, when President Clinton took office, the first term of the Clinton office, you became the chairperson of the House of Representatives Armed Services Committee.
Right.
Now, that was at the same time that the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Eastern European Socialist Bloc countries had collapsed. The Cold War came to an end. So there was a great expectation that there would be what was called then a peace dividend,
right.
Meaning now that the world the Cold War had shifted, it had ended, there was no world adversary that the U.S. was facing, that there could be that sort of reallocation of resources towards the domestic budget. It didn't really happen. There was some scaling back, but within a short amount of time, the budget grew and grew and grew and grew, and then after 2001, after September 11th, it took off. Yeah. Now, President Eisenhower, in his farewell address in 1961, said, "Beware, America, of the danger of a military-industrial complex."
Right, right.
That it was something new. Now, he was a general. He wasn't a pacifist by any means. Is there a military-industrial complex? Has it fulfilled Eisenhower's fears? Is it the dominant power here in Washington?
Yeah. Okay, let me just back up, and I'm going to come back to the answer to your question. You're absolutely right. The end of the Cold War was so significant, they didn't have a name for it. They just called it, post. Okay?
Post-Cold War.
Post-Cold War. But it was a great moment because it was a moment that, in my opinion, allowed us to assess the real threats and develop a national security agenda going forward that at the end of the day would have redounded to a peace dividend that would have allowed us to redirect our resources into the domestic agenda. One of the things I said was, A, you got to have a foreign policy framework that makes sense. B, you've got to have a properly sized, properly trained, properly equipped military based on the threats you perceive. But then thirdly, even if you've got the greatest military force on the face of the earth and your cities are deteriorating, what are you defending? So at the end of the day, the domestic agenda and life in this country has to be on the table as the third block in the national security agenda of the United States. And that was very important. But I agree with you. It was a moment that we only touched briefly, and the moment ultimately was blown. Now, was that moment blown simply, singularly, or solely because of the, quote, military-industrial complex? My answer would be no. I think that they played a role because constituencies are constituencies, all right? So, if you're there and you've got a system, you've got a program, you've got a contract, all right, then there's a constituency for that
an incentive,
effort.
An incentive.
Tremendous incentive. So you said, look, I'm employing X amount of people in your community. We're spending X amount of dollars in your community. If you cut this program, we're going to be weak. We're going to lose. All these things, that's real. But then also inserted into that conversation is the politics. The politics that you and I see on a daily basis, where members of Congress, elected representatives in the House or in the Senate or even in the White House start to make the comment, are we cutting too much? Are we weak on defense? Will this harm us? And then how American people perceive that is how people, how politicians articulate. So my long answer to you is I think it's a combination of both the politics of the situation as well as the economics that are part of the military-industrial complex that he alluded to.
Right now, the U.S. has left Iraq. Of course, there's a very big embassy in downtown Baghdad, 16,000 staff people, 8,000 of whom will be armed, the size of a private army. But formally, all military troops are out. President Obama said in his recent address about reducing the growth of the military budget that we were transitioning out of Afghanistan as well. And going past the period of nation building. When you look at that picture, do you think that the United States was in fact militarily driven from Iraq? In other words, are they just putting a nice face on this? They couldn't achieve the pacification of the country. And likewise, the inability to defeat, 10 years into the Afghanistan war, the armed insurgent groups. It's not just Taliban, many armed insurgent groups. Is this really a reflection that, similar to what we saw and what you saw at the end of the Vietnam War, the limits of U.S. military power?
Right. Yeah. As I said, problems of the world tend not to lend themselves on an increasing basis to a military solution. All right? Number one. Number two, I don't think that our folks were trained for counterinsurgency. Number three, the definition of winning a military war has radically changed because we're not fighting wars the way we used to fight wars, tank to tank, ship to ship, plane to plane, military unit to military unit. The way wars are fought now is radically different. There's terrorism, roadside bombing, counterinsurgency efforts. All right, so you can't really talk about war today as you talked about war 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. All right, because the world has radically changed and the way people engage in violence and military violence is very, very different. So I don't think it was so much they were driven out by military force, that I think people came to the realization that these problems can't be solved militarily, and that the longer you stay there, the more you endanger people, the more resources you spend, and the more futile it becomes. So I'm suggesting to you that Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, the United States, China, other countries, we have much more in common that should bring us to the table to start working with each other as a community of nations than continuing to engage in the insanity of engaging in military combat. Global economics harms us. You cough, I catch a cold in the world. Global environmental climate change, all right? Climate change could affect us in a way that food that used to be in your country may now be in mine, so now you got to come to me in different ways. Water, food security, etc. Cyberspace security is a major, major issue. Global infectious diseases are major issues. These are issues that should require us to come together to sit down and say, how do we go forward in a way that allows the human family to continue to exist? And that's not engaging in wars, in these other. As long as we spend our time, our money, and our resources engaging in these kind of Afghanistan, Iraq fights, it's energy that we're not expending sitting down with each other saying, we've got a lot in common. The global family is in the foxhole. We're all in it together, and we've got to figure out how to survive together. And that's not continuing to wage these absurd military wars that don't address the problem.
Thank you for that. I want to talk about the global family concept, because when I was here in Washington, D.C., and you may have been as well, when President Bush got in that helicopter and said goodbye, and President Obama raised his hand and took the oath of office and became the next president on January 20th, 2009. Yeah. And there was a feeling of euphoria, optimism. It was a sense that not only was Bush leaving, but perhaps the Bush era was going. And I think most of the people who supported Obama would embrace it in exactly the words you used. Like, let's find another way. Let's have a different way of dealing with things. Let's identify the things that we have in common. Climate change, infectious disease, poverty. And yet, a lot of that has continued. You look back at the Middle East, and you take Iran, for instance. In the case of Iran, while there was a hope that there would be a reconciliation or a new day or a press the reset button, there was more threats, more sanctions, more tension, and it seemed like, and President Obama and Hillary Clinton said, well, we rule nothing out, we take no option off the table. In other words, threatening military action. If the people wanted it, embraced the logical, rational argument that you made about what brings us together, Why can't we realize that? Why aren't we realizing that, in your opinion? Okay. Unless you think we are.
No, I'll give you two thoughts on that. Number one, part of the problem is the burden of carrying the past into, well, those issues that were there when President Obama walked in. He had to deal with those issues because they were still on the table. All right. So Iraq was on the table, et cetera, et cetera. So part of that was dealing with transition. The second thing, and I'll just say this very honestly, big part of the problem is letting go. Is letting go of conventional wisdom. Letting go of conventional wisdom that says these problems can be solved through military means. These problems can be solved by, Pax Americana. We're this strong. We're gonna press you on these issues. In my humble opinion, those days are over. And the faster we come to understand that our future lies not in our capacity to stand alone as this great, powerful superpower, but rather our ability to relate to other nations as a family of nations, because we're all in this together, the faster we'll get there. So I'm saying part of the problem was, how do you handle what was on the table when you walked in the door? Because they don't just disappear. So now we're seeing those things being walked away. And secondly, how do you transition to a new point of view in a way that is not so shocking that it becomes disturbing to people? I mean, look, you and I live in the real world. It's very difficult for people to go from A to B,
But President Obama said,
you know what I'm saying?
This is change. I know, I hear you, but I want to keep probing this to see what the real dynamic is, because President Obama created this euphoric sense, a historic election, years or even months before he was elected. The idea that a black man in America, in a country where racism was such a dominant part of its history, that in this country a black man with a slogan that says "Change we can believe in" could be elected, that would have been, people would have thought you were crazy a little bit before that, and yet it happened.
Yes.
And yet we seem to go back into that conventional wisdom. Now, you made the posture, like you are already in this kind of macho state. But why does the United States have to be in that state? Why does it have to? Where did it come from, and why does it continue?
Okay. Because with a tremendous amount of diligence, Second World War, going forward, we awakened one morning and we were the world superpower. We had tremendous military force. We had nuclear weapons. We were the major force. We stood toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. We were the great superpower, all right? Pax Americana. What we wanted, we could have that major impact on the world. That's heady. That's very powerful. And it's very powerful and difficult to give up. And if you notice, candidates who are running for president now are saying, we must return to the era of American domination. Well, my response is, if you look at the world in reality, we're never going to get back to that. Those are yesterday's slogans, but they're difficult to give up, you see? And I think that's the problem. It's how do you give up the heady wine when you've been out there practicing and experiencing being the great superpower, and now having to redefine the problems of the world in a way that forces you to start engaging with other countries and framing your foreign policy in a way that you've never had to frame it before. That's a significant mindset change. I personally think Obama is trying to make that transition, but trying to make that transition in a political context that is focused on certain kinds of realities. There are people being very combative who wants to end it. But let me just make one other point. As a black guy, okay, we're not Superman. Black man's going to become president. The world's going to change in 24 hours. Well, President Obama's a bright guy. He's a smart guy, and I think he's trying to go in the right direction. But he's not Superman. He doesn't change his clothes in the phone booth. And I think for people to make that assertion that some kind of way, here, this guy alone is going to change. We know, you and I, we're We're not naive people. We know that no one person is going to take the world on their shoulders and change the world by themselves. Over the last 12 months, the drama between the Congress and the President of the United States makes that point writ large. The President cannot do this alone. Our government was not established for the President to do this alone. And so I understand the euphoria. I understand breaking the barrier of race so that Martin Luther King could say, okay, we moved the ball further along. Keep that reality in mind, but that doesn't mean suddenly that everything goes away and you give it to this guy and you said, wow, I don't like you. You didn't change the world in a few days. That's an absurd notion.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to come back to this concept of the family of nations and trying to find a way to go together and the countervailing forces that are pushing back against that. Because you can clearly see, again, I think the position you outlined is the popular position in America, not with all, but with, I would say, the majority or very large minority. And certainly the people of the world would yearn for a change from the United States. They're looking to the United States in some ways. On September 11th, September 12th, after the September 11th attacks, messages of support and sympathy poured into the United States. There was a huge amount of support because of the nature of the attack. And yet within a few years, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, after Pakistan, the public opinion, global public opinion, had turned into its opposite. That in fact the United States had become more isolated, more marginalized. And do you feel that this old thinking, this conventional wisdom, as you put it, this interventionist policy, at this day and age, instead of winning victories on the battlefield, only has the effect of galvanizing sort of global resentment? And if so, what can the Americans do about it, the American government?
I think that's exactly the point. That continuing this conventional wisdom, continuing this idea of Pax Americana, that we alone, we are the super, we can dictate to the world, we can do all these things, we can solve many of these problems militarily, that conventional wisdom, that does, it only increases the antagonism because it prohibits us from reaching out to the world in different ways. All right, so that I'm not now threatening you, but I'm saying, look, our enlightened self-interest is in our ability to sit down and communicate with each other, my friend. At the end of the day, there are forces much larger than us. So for you and I to kick sand in each other's face right now, and when we're looking at global problems that can dwarf us, it's an absurdity, all right? Well, it takes time to get there.
And we're going to see where that goes. Our half an hour is up.
Oh, my God.
I want to thank you, Congressman Ron Dellums, Mayor Ron Dellums. That's it. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.